when I was asked to give this talk here, it was a great privilege, but I also realized what a challenge it is. I was asked to see if I could say something that inspires you, that changes your perspective, that maybe motivates you to be a leader in the future. And I thought that's very difficult. So what I thought I'd do is I share with you my own experience, my own journey, because it seems like just yesterday that I was your age, 15, 16, 14, and now I realize I'm the age that my kids are your age. I have two kids that are 15 and 17. So I'll share with you sort of what I did and what choices I made and what I was thinking perhaps it might help with your own decisions. So first, when I saw your motto, Grow, Discover, Dream, I thought that's probably, for me, that would be the other way around. For me, it's more like this dream, discover, grow. When I was reflecting when I was your age, the first thing I realized that I'm incredibly envious of your generation and what you do and what my kids have. Because, for example, you guys are growing up in an environment that is incredibly international, particularly in Hong Kong, particularly at schools like Discovery College. You probably have many friends that speak different languages. You probably speak more than just one language. And you probably traveled a lot. You probably traveled regionally. Many of you will have traveled globally. In fact, you probably have traveled in your childhood more than I did in the first 30 years of my life. And probably you traveled more than my parents did in their entire lives. And all those things are fantastic, and you're probably not quite aware of that. You have access to what must be the biggest store, the biggest repository of knowledge and information and source of education that mankind ever had, and that, of course, is the internet. But you're growing up with it, so again, you're taking these things probably for granted. And you have computers in your pocket, like your iPhone, your Android phone. Even at the time when you were born in 1995, that filled that kind of computing power, the GPS system, the cameras, all those kinds of things, the music store, that's filled several truckloads worth of equipment. And you have it in your pocket today. Now, my life back in the 70s was very different. But at the end, I probably had very similar choices to make that you have. So when I grew up, we had 2 or 3 public TV stations. Some of them only started at 8 o'clock at night. They were, of course, because they were public sort of state-controlled, so extremely limited sources of information. We traveled hardly did any international travel. I grew up in Germany, in Hamburg, so we traveled to the Baltic Sea and spent pretty much the whole summer there. So we had sort of a black and white life, I remember. It was a very narrow, very sort of localized view of life, very homogeneous, not many international friends at the time. But of course, my parents were telling me the same thing. They were saying, you with your blue jeans and you're going to these discos, you're just having a good life. When we grew up, it was, we lived through a Second World War. They grew up with hunger after the war. They had the fear of nuclear conflict at the time because they had seen those things in the Second World War. So it's kind of ironic that, I think any generation thinks their kids have it so much better off. But there were also some really interesting, on the positive side, there were some really amazing things happening back at the time. And I saw some of those things, and some of them inspired me. And you probably today are surrounded by very interesting things. You just need to sort of find them. One of the things that was happening is on the computer technology side. Some people used computers and transistors and integrated circuit boards to create the first synthesizers. This is a Moog synthesizer back in the 70s. And basically they took computing technology and used it for something totally different, to make music. And some artists, like these guys from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, they produced music that was never heard before, using this kind of very primitive technology. So they made the best out of what was available in very innovative, interesting ways. And again, you can think about what would be equivalent today. These guys you probably know well. They were actually just 3 years older than I am. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, those guys basically saw the seeds of the emerging computer technology that nobody took seriously at the time. People were thinking they were just sort of kids playing around, not doing anything seriously. And this is funny, this is Bill Gates when he was arrested, I think, for driving without a valid license back in 75. But personally, we had also some very interesting. There was a music teacher in my high school who somehow managed to get hold of a mini MOOC. This was sort of the equivalent of, it was a MOOC synthesizer, but small, modular, and we could play with it. And that probably inspired me to start doing electronic music 30 days later, when it was sitting in, laptops that you have here. Another interesting thing was happening. So it was not all black and white and boring. Our math teacher had a computer back in the 70s that had to be programmed with little papers, of little strips of papers and hole in them. But both of those things, probably without me realizing at the time, had an influence of my choices later, because I was fascinated by early computers and what they could do, by technology, and by the use of technology for sort of unexpected purposes, perhaps. Another interesting thing, perhaps, is to think about what happened to technology. So 10 years later, back in 1987, when I was living in New York, I had a Macintosh SE. And this Macintosh SE was an amazing little machine I could actually build. I programmed a little dictionary that was Japanese and German, and I had in English, and I had little sounds in there. And then it was running out of space because the hard disk was fairly small. And then if I look at just 15 years later, if I look at the computing technology today and one of today's sort of standard iMacs, how many of those Macintosh SE do you think you would have to have the equivalent of the hard disk of this machine today? And the answer, unless I got my math wrong, is pretty amazing. It's actually 100,000. So just within a short period of time, the technology has changed so drastically. And it's not just the mathematics of having more disk space. That meant that you could do entirely new things. You could do videos, you could do music, you could do some of the things that I'm doing today with 3D Avatar School. So the technology has enabled things that are pretty amazing. Now, another interesting situation that I had, which is probably similar today what you have, your teachers, your parents, your society gives you very concrete advice what you should be doing, what you should not be doing. And if I reflected back on what my parents told me I should go and do a Banklehre in German, like a banking apprenticeship. And they gave me a few other advice, and I'm so glad that I did not listen to my parents, because if I would have done this, I would probably be still sitting in Hamburg, working in some bank and being pretty unhappy with what I did. So the interesting thing is that I never really listened to what my parents were telling me, but you have to sort of make the right choices there. So what I did is I was fascinated by computing technology. So as soon as I could, I grew up in Hamburg, as I mentioned. And this is an example of a bad hair day that we had every day back in the 70s. This is me when I think I was your age, bored and looking strange. So as soon as I could after university, I left Hamburg and I went to Switzerland to start doing computer programming, things that I enjoyed. And I pretty much followed my curiosity, what I found interesting, exploring things, doing new things. And that was for me fantastic. So I did this in Switzerland for a few years, and then I got bored there and I moved to New York. And there things are getting a bit more serious. I started doing management consulting, and I did this for a long time, and I made a lot of money, had luxurious vacation, had a great time, but I realized over the years that what I was doing, I was not really enjoying. I was doing boring presentations and reports and spent what I increasingly found, not that meaningful. I didn't have any impact. I wasn't really changing anything, but I was making a lot of money. So then I realized, okay, this is not what I want to do for too long with my life. So I decided to go and join a startup called Shazam, which some of you might know. This was in the very beginning when there were only 4 people that had the idea, and then I joined as the 5th person. And there I had a great time, because this was something that I found the idea passionate. It was, again, a use of technology for some very interesting things. It was just at the cusp where technology-wise this was possible. And I really enjoyed that kind of thing, which was much better. I didn't make as much money as previously, but much more interesting and satisfying and fulfilling. And so I stayed on that journey, and then came to Hong Kong and started 3D Avatar School. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Basically, at that point, I realized that technology is, so strong now. It has graphic cards in each machine that you can do amazing things, and it has broadband, high-speed broadband that is always available. And with those two things, you can do things like World of Warcraft and multiplayer, where kids basically, players play in the same virtual space. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if you could take those principles of kids being connected in real time in a virtual space, and you could apply that to education. So people who might have handicaps or who might be too shy to participate as much in an education environment, what if we could use that kind of thing for education? So then I looked at what people are doing when they are playing World of Warcraft. And it's quite sophisticated and pretty amazing what's happening there. And then I looked at traditional education, which hasn't really changed over probably 400 years. You still have a classroom where one teacher typically talks to students. There's very little interaction, and this far cry from those kinds of game environments. So then we basically developed a range of 3D learning experiences using very similar principles, like what you find in games, to make learning much more interesting. So we now have a Mandarin Chinese program, and we're launching English in Chinese schools next year, where we're using kids and live teachers from somewhere in the world connected through computers, and we have created this series of engaging game-like environments where basically teachers teach in a much more fun way languages, English and Chinese. And personally, that's probably the most satisfying and most interesting thing I've done, but it sort of builds up on these other things. Now, if I'm thinking back what sort of advice I could give to you, first of all, nobody can tell you specifically what you should be doing, I think. And I don't think, anybody who would claim that I would have doubts, because our parents couldn't predict what the future would hold for us. So I think it would be very difficult to do that. You have to find it out yourself, but you're probably surrounded by pretty amazing tools. I also realized that your generation has so much more pressure than we ever had. It's all about getting good grades, getting in prestigious universities, and sometimes I think there's a danger of forgetting that there is a life outside school and university, and it's sort of a pity if you don't exploit that while being faced with this pressure. So my advice to sum things up would be to follow your curiosity and your passion. Do something that you enjoy, because that's probably the area where you would be best at. And you have tools, explore, make music, maybe start learning folding origami. These, by the way, are today's software synthesizers that for a few $100s you could put into any of your laptops. They are 1,000 times more powerful than these things that used to live in these big cabinets. And it's great fun to play some of those. But basically you're surrounded by technology that gives you tools that are professional grade just 10, 15 years ago. The question is, what can you do with those kinds of things? But also try to be open, because there's a danger in using something like Facebook today. If you're not careful, you might end up in the same way that I was back in Germany in the 70s, because you're just surrounded with your Facebook friends, and they all share the same values, they all sort of like you, and if you're only depending on that, then you might end up with the same sort of relatively narrow group of opinions and ideas. So you have to look outside that a little bit. But I think also be aware of the actions that you're doing now will have an impact on the next generation. And that's something one of the previous speakers said this very vividly. That's something that our generation was totally guilty of, because we grew up with these disposable things, we didn't pay any attention, and we sort of left a little bit of a mess behind to the next generation. So that's pretty much all I can tell you. In 2 words, I would say stay curious and have fun. Thank you.